Thank you, Rolando. Actually, it was Rolando who asked me to say a few words just before the session started, and I'm very pleased to be able to do so in order to express my gratitude to Rolando and many others who've helped to create this remarkable 4-month success of Leninist Days, which I think has great significance, a global engagement as we seek to make sense of Lenin and his ideas and his times and our times. There has been a richness in the diverse range of opinions and insights that have been brought to the table in these 4 months. As we wrestle with the question of what is to be done, what can we do to make a difference in the struggles against oppression is one of the motivating factors that brings all of us here. And also, how can we best make use of Lenin and his ideas in that effort? Lenin is a continuing presence throughout the rest of this year, of course, this 100th anniversary of his death. And one of the upcoming events that's taking place later this year is in November in London, the Historical Materialism Conference. My hope is that as many of us as possible can make it to that and engage face-to-face with each other. And there will be a Leninist Days panel that Rolando and Sebastian and others will be part of. And so the conference, that what we've been trying to do in this 4-month Leninist Days extravaganza is going to be continuing not only for the rest of the year, but past this year, as we're all struggling for a better world. And for all of this, I want to again thank Rolando, and I want to thank all of you for helping to make this a reality. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. Well, yes, firstly, I wanted to say what a success I think this event, multi-month event, Leninist Days, has been. I can tell you, as somebody who was involved in one of the first attempts to try and reopen the discussion around Lenin and his theoretical and political legacy, namely a conference organized some years ago in Essen in Germany with Slavoj Žižek and others, a conference that was published later under the title Lenin Reloaded. We really thought at that time that it was almost a provocation, almost a kind of wild wager that we could reintroduce Lenin and his legacy into the broader theoretical discussions. And I think that the success of these Leninist Days is real evidence that we've made a substantial step forward. And I have to particularly underline, I mean, there are many comrades who have participated in this success and need to be thanked, but I think Rolando's persistence and doggedness in keeping this rather ramshackle, complicated series of events on the road has been remarkable. And I hope that once the recordings are released, they will reach an even wider public. And as Paul says, I hope these discussions then can continue both online and in other forms throughout the rest of the year and beyond. And as he says, we will continue these discussions at the forthcoming London Historical Materialism Conference, which is from the 7th to the 10th of November. You can check that out on historicalmaterialism.org website. Anyway, I think it's also very suitable that the first of these events was the first speaker in this series of events was the veteran of Lenin studies, so Paul LeBlanc, and that the last event should be Peter Thomas, who comes from a very different generation from Paul's, and is, if you like, the the next wave of amongst the next wave of scholars working on Lenin and Marxist theory. So it's a nice symmetry to that. So just to introduce Peter Thomas, who I think is known to many of you already. Peter is professor at the University of Brunel in London after a rather peripatetic academic career, which took him from Australia to Berlin, to Naples, to Amsterdam, to Vienna, to many other places. He finally settled in the lovely town of London, which I'm sure he's extremely happy to be living in, where he, as I say, is a professor of philosophy, history of philosophy and political theory. Peter will be known to many of you for his first book, where he burst onto the theoretical scene, The Gramscian Moment, Philosophy, Hegemony and Marxism, which he published with the Historical Materialism book series, and is obviously available both as a hardback from Brill and as a paperback from Haymarket Books. But Peter has then gone on to publish a number of important works. He edited the book with Riccardo Bellafiore, Guido Starosta, in Marx's Laboratory, Critical Interpretations of the Grundrisse, also in the Historical Materialism book series, a very important collective volume, and also edited in the same series, The Government of Time, Theories of Plural Temporality in the Marxist Tradition, with Vittorio Morfino. And he also translated, is the translator of a number of works, one of which is Roberto Finelli's A Failed Parricide, Hegel and the Young Marx, also in the Historical Materialism book series. And indeed, Peter has been a stalwart member of the Historical Materialism journal, book series, and conferences from the very moment he arrived in Europe. Peter is the author of an important new book, which has just been published by Oxford University Press, the title of which is Radical Politics on the Causes of Contemporary Emancipation, which is an extremely important intervention on political theory, and I encourage everybody to check that out and to read that book. And I hope we will have discussions of that book, online and, as I say, in person in various venues over the next period of time. Today, Peter is going to be giving a paper not on Gramsci directly, as you might expect, but on Lenin. And the title of Peter's paper today is Lenin's Alternative, A Politics of Another Type. So I think that's enough introduction, and I will hand over now to Peter for his paper.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you once again very much to Rolando and Paul and all the other organizers of this really quite crazy and astounding Leninist journey. Watching it unfold has been really quite a remarkable experience. And it takes a certain Leninist will and determination, I think, to keep such an operation on track so carefully. So many thanks to the comrades for the excellent Leninist discipline that's being displayed here. And thank you also to Sebastian for his very generous comments. His references to generational affiliations almost made me feel young again. So I'll be speaking today on the topic of Lenin's alternative, a politics of another type. And I'm going to be focusing in on a very specific, quite a limited Lenin in some senses. There are, of course, many Lenins, as the quite astounding gallery of images that we've seen displayed throughout this series over the last months so amply attests. And I think it's one of the sure signs of Lenin's now assuredly almost classical status that so many different readers have and continue to be able to find in his thought and activity so many different ways of approaching both, strictly speaking, historical events and, more crucially, contemporary issues. and above all, perhaps what really signals Lenin out as a classic in the classical sense, the way in which Lenin can constitute for us something like a lens with which to view the consistent intertwining of the historical with the contemporary. So it can never, it seems to me, be a question of choosing between one or another of these Lenins, although there will always be those who insist upon various forms of orthodox purity. But we could try and set up a whole series of oppositions that ultimately I think we would need to refuse. An opposition between, for example, Lenin, the militant party organizer and austere theorist of organizational discipline, versus the Lenin who's perhaps a little bit more of an anarchistic tactician of the temporal specificity of a particular political intervention into a given set of relations of forces. Or we could set up an opposition between Lenin as what we might want to call perhaps a poetic, maybe even Dadaesque practitioner of the appropriately or justly timed deployment of the slogan versus the quite hard-headed pragmatic policy advocate we see in the period of the new economic policy and his final calls for cultural revolution. And the list could go on between a whole variety of different images of Lenin. I think as this series of events has amply demonstrated, in fact, we don't need to choose between one or another of these Lenins. We need all of these Lenins. And I think it can be taken as the sign of a real growing maturity of our generation of socialist and Marxist culture, that somehow holding all things together through all the various inevitable conflicts, we're demonstrating a collective capacity to inherit all of these different possibilities of Lenin, even and especially in their conflicts, and above all, in the creativity that occurs when these discordant images can be brought together in a common collective project. As said, today I want to focus in on only one of these Lenins, and in some ways on a very brief, almost ephemeral, and maybe even marginal moment in Lenin's overall evolution, even though the particular moment I'll be focusing on in terms of its later influence and inheritance and contestation by various Marxist and non-Marxist currents might have made it appear to us in the past that this was a moment that was much more central to Lenin's thought and practice as a whole than I think was in reality historically or textually the case. So I'm referring here to Lenin as the theorist of the novel and troubling notion of dual power in those middle months of 1917. And my overarching thesis today will be that it is this Lenin who outlines, and very much, I emphasize, outlines only, an alternative conception of political power, and more precisely, one who outlines the conception of a type of politics that could function as an alternative to the main currents of modern political thought and practice. So first, before launching into my explanation of what I think is so different about what Lenin has done, I need to outline in some ways how I'm characterizing with very broad and deliberately caricatured brushstrokes these main currents of modern political thought. So very schematically, I would suggest that these main currents can be characterized in their unity as a line of thinking that we can see as running throughout many of the major classical figures of modern political thought, from Hobbes to Rousseau to Weber to Schmitt to Bobbio to Rawls and beyond. It's a tradition that thinks politics as such, so politics qua politics, in the sense of a unity, and in one way or another thinks politics as fundamentally, when all is said and done and it comes down to it, a relation of authority and command. This is obviously a very internally contradictory and conflicting tradition, but nevertheless, I think there is a red thread running through all of these authors thinking of politics in these terms of a relation of authority and command. Politics for this tradition, as I'm characterizing it, is constituted as that particular instance in modern social formations that in a literal sense forces them. It's a sort of modernized version of a prime mover conception. Politics functions as an instance of regulation, decision, and consequently of the imposition of order on the disorder that is taken to characterize both the pre and the non-political. And often those notions, the pre and the non-political, go together. However this pre or non-political is characterized, whether it's conceived in a communitarian sense as a non-political social, in terms of the calculations of the economic, the ethical, the moral, or any of the other various things that we might set up as that which becomes before or lies outside the political, strictly said. It is a conception of politics that I think logically, structurally culminates in the principle and practice of politics as representation in a very precise tense. That is, the representation of that which has been deliberately made absent, precisely in order to render that which has been made absent representable or representable. In this sense, I would suggest representation should be understood not only in a narrowly institutional sense, as the valorization of the responsible and judicious consciousness of the representative, which we can set against the caprice, as it were, of the merely delegate, the type of theorization of representation we can find in the thought of Burke, for instance, or at least in one reading, traditional reading of Burke's thought. Rather, the type of representation I'm discussing should be conceived of in a broader sense as a formalization of the wider practices of the absenting of the energies and perspectives of the overwhelming majority of actors in a social formation and their replacement by elites of various type in political processes as they come to be strictly understood. So here I'm referring to the way in which what we could call the working classes in the broadest sense, popular classes in another formulation, in Gramsci's terms, dear to me, the subaltern social groups, the way in which their active participation in politics is structurally negated, and the energies that they continually push forward onto the political field are necessarily absented in order to structure politics as a representative practice. It is not only Hobbes's almost paradigmatically representative figure of the Leviathan. We all remember the famous front piece from Leviathan and in its representative dimensions that we should consider here in this expanded optic of representation as a type of social logic of political modernity. Even according to this conception, even someone who was a very open critic of representative institutions in the political field, such as Rousseau, would, I argue, reproduce this logic of a type of representative absenting of popular political energies at the very heart of his notion of the general will, and particularly in that crucial moment in his formulation where we have the rapid transition to the will, to the general will, in order to get away from the types of seditious possibilities still inherent in a mere will of all. And in some senses, I would argue, if we want to really stretch in a caricatured faction, we have a type, almost an ideal type before the formulation of the concept in the notion of the general will, which seeks to regulate those factional interests that threaten the possibility of the general will positing its transcendental imposition of order in order to enable politics to get going. Bourgeois and capitalist politics, in this expanded sense I'm arguing for, is thus constitutively representative, even when it does not understand itself as such. It's a key moment in the condensation of the more general processes of what I've elsewhere called, following Gramsci, the processes of subalternization that characterize political modernity as such. And obviously the type of substitutionism that goes on in this process of the representative absenting of popular energies is by no means limited to the formal institutions of bourgeois representative democracy. These dynamics have clearly been present even and especially in the history of many oppositional political forces. So in what sense am I attempting to argue that the notion of dual power, as employed by Lenin in the middle of 1917, represents an alternative to this main representative current of the party of bourgeois political order? In order to understand dual power in this sense, I think we first need to set aside some of the traditional and very influential ways in which we've often understood the distinctiveness of dual power. So firstly, a situation of dual power for Lenin, the type of situation that he argues was occurring in 1917, was not produced through the application of political will. The Russian revolutionaries didn't get to choose a situation of dual power. As Lenin originally elaborated this very elusive notion in the space between the two revolutions of 1917, dual power was not presented as a matter of choice or the more or less subjective decision by a given political actor of one strategic proposal over another at any particular time, non-contextually determined. For Lenin, dual power was instead a relation of force that was inscribed very specifically in the structure of that very specific conjuncture of crisis. Or expressed in another way, dual power was the very structure of that conjunctural crisis itself, which in turn was a moment of intensification of an underlying structural contradiction in political modernity. Or it represented, if we wanted, the extent to which the revolutionary conjunctural crisis of 1917 was not in some ways arbitrary, but was symptomatic, expressive of the structural crisis of political modernity itself as an enduring crisis. The second, perhaps traditional way of viewing dual power that I think we need to set aside to see forward further to Lenin's alternative is the notion that dual power might be some type of subjectively determined exodus, to use perhaps more contemporary language, from politics as it was actually given at the time. Dual power was not for Lenin a simple rejection of engagement with the existing state apparatus in favor of some type of purer power or politics located always elsewhere. Lenin, in fact, had always argued that engagement with the state, including the mechanisms, indeed even of parliamentary democracy, may be tactically useful for the revolutionary movement in particular conjunctures and under certain precise political conditions. And I think also a part of the novelty of his notion of dual power in 1917 is that he continues to mobilize this, as it were, realistic or pragmatic perspective precisely in the midst of revolutionary crisis in order to think the necessary impurity of the situation of dual power, not as a promised land beyond existing politics, but precisely as a dislocation internal to it. The third perspective I think we need to move beyond is the notion that Lenin had everything fully worked out when he's putting forward the notion of dual power. Dual power, when we look at the way it's working in Lenin's text in 1917, isn't really a fully developed theory. It's a word or a phrase or a term. It's this eruptive, disruptive moment where somehow Lenin sees something conceptually in a very intense form. And in some ways, the whole game becomes then of how can this possibly be cashed out, and a fully fledged theory of it developed, not just by Lenin, but by all of his readers who come out to him afterwards. And I think that's one of the fascinating elements of reading these texts, in particular in 1917, of having a real intuition that something is happening here, and precisely working out what that is the type of challenge or the opportunity that Lenin poses to his readers. With all due respect to a very attentive reader of Lenin, such as Nikos Poulantzas, it simply is not true that all Lenin's analyses and actions are traversed by a sort of leitmotif of dual power. At least according to my reading of Lenin's works, the term dual power is not really prominent at all, if at all, in Lenin's many writings before the Russian Revolution of 1917, and also afterwards. The focus on the notion of dual power emerges explicitly in a textually referenced form in Lenin's political vocabulary in this very specific moment of interregnum between the two revolutions of February and October 1917. And here I think an important way of distinguishing between what's going on in Lenin's thinking in different phases has been offered to us by, for me, the incredibly influential work of Lars Lee, and particularly some of Lars's work exploring conceptions of power, as we might translate it into English, notions of the Flast, throughout the Bolshevik tradition. And Lenin's situated in that type of political imaginary and vocabulary in quite distinctive ways. So in order to try to clarify what I think is the peculiarity or the specificity of Lenin's conceptual proposal with these words, dual power, simple words, in this period, we need to turn then to consider the specificity of this particular moment of its formulation in his texts and practice. Now, one can argue, if one adopts a certain type of Althuserian rhetoric, that dual power is already present in a sort of practical state in the April theories, while Lenin is journeying away across Europe on the sealed train and so forth towards the Finland station. But it's actually formulated explicitly only in an article that is published in Pravda on the 9th of April, and then most famously presented in the text, The Task of the Proletariat in Our Revolution, written a day later on the 10th of April, but not published until much later in the year. The term dual power was used as an attempt in this text, in the text published in Pravda, as an attempt to comprehend the entirely, what Lenin calls, unexpected interlocking of two dictatorships. So we have the Soviets ranged against the provisional government. And there's a certain forcing of this notion already in Lenin of characterizing some type of parity between the claims of the Soviets that Lenin is looking to encourage and the existing realities, as it were, of the provisional government. There in Pravda, Lenin explicitly notes that nobody previously thought or could have thought of a dual power. So it wasn't something that was apparent to himself even before the moment. It almost emerges in response to a reading of the conjuncture. The type of political power that Lenin saw as embodied, at least potentially or in latent and almost actualizing form in the Soviets, had emerged indeed outside, but also alongside the existing state apparatus, an apparatus that in its totality had been severely weakened in both legitimacy and functioning by the major social and political crises unfolding, not least of which the Revolution of February. Dual power was here configured in Lenin's mind not as the positing of a sort of pure power versus impure power, provisional government bad, dual power good. Rather, it represented an analysis of a reality of the conjuncture. Dual power was an unstable type of mixed government of the competing claims of what I could call, using some of Gramsci's language, on the one hand, political society, the conception of an organizing instance in a social formation, and of civil society, or the notion of associative instances in that society. And dual power was at precisely the moment when there was a destabilizing of the normal hierarchies that regulated the subordination of civil society to political society. The social bases of what Lenin variously calls here these two governments or dictatorships in stronger terms were, of course, entirely different. The provisional government was a state in the proper sense of the term. That is, a state apparatus founded upon a notion of abstract law and ultimately, as Lenin understood, the rights, as they were codified constitutionally, of private property. The Soviets, on the other hand, represented a special type of state, a term that Lenin takes up from his reflections upon Marx's reflections on the Commune, and to which he'll continually return over these months, obviously most prominently in the State and Revolution. Both the Commune and the Soviets were founded upon and functioned as popular initiative. And in particular, what was crucial for Lenin's analyses of this elective affinity or constellation in Benjamin's sense was the way in which both moments saw the replacement of the police and army by the rather Machiavellian proposal of the arming of the people itself. Additionally, also, of course, direct popular control of officialdom, concrete critique of bureaucracy, valorization of delegation rather than representation. These two governments were, in the strictest sense, mutually incompatible political powers. They were founded on entirely different presuppositions regarding the nature and functioning of political institutions, and indeed, the nature and functioning of politics itself. The antagonism between these two governments or dictatorships necessarily had to end in the disappearance of one or the other. They existed as a contradiction. Necessarily, the development of historical events would see them transformed into an antinomy. Lenin insisted on the exceptional and necessarily temporary nature of this conjuncture, and he writes, "There is not the slightest doubt that such an interlocking cannot last long. Two powers cannot exist in a state," he argued. This is important to conceive of dual power as not something lying beyond the existing state, but a conjuncture within its structures and precisely the moment of its crisis. He goes on and emphasizes even further, dual power merely expresses a transitional phase in the revolution's development. So from the moment of insertion within the existing state organization, Lenin then reinserts dual power in the temporal scheme of the unfolding of the revolution, as it were, sublating in a genuinely dialectical fashion dual power's inclusion in the existing order in order to open it to its construction of a new order. The notion of dual power is not just transitional in itself, as it were. The very notion of dual power represents, I think, a transitional phase in Lenin's thought, as he was attempting to comprehend the unprecedented configurations that had been thrown up in 1917. It's a phase that traverses the highs and the lows of the summer of 1917, and then reaches what we have come to see as, in some ways, its programmatic conclusion in his formally articulated reflections on Marx's writings on the Paris Commune in The State and Revolution. An absolutely remarkable text, which I think in many ways can legitimately be inscribed amongst the great unfinished works of the materialist tradition. And here I'm recalling some very interesting insights Slavoj Žižek formulated many years ago in one of his early and still, I think, best works on Schelling, making an argument for this sense of incompletion as constitutive of works in the materialist philosophical tradition. It seems to me that The State and Revolution fits in to that conception quite well. The State and Revolution is begun during what we could call Lenin's almost Machiavellian solitude, his time as an outlaw roaming in the countrysides, in haystacks and in various disguises. It's a work, however, that he then quite happily abandoned in Valéry's sense that a poem is never finished but merely abandoned. When the revolutionary upsurge then later on in the year returns, particularly in the early autumn, as things move through to their conclusion. And there's a fascinating correspondence here on which I've always reflected. Spinoza's Tractatus Politicus, a great text of the materialist tradition that is also unfinished, it breaks off just as the moment when Spinoza's getting into the discussion of the nature of democracy, which we've all been expecting. This is the moment when the whole novelty of Spinoza's political thought is going to be cashed out. Well, so Lenin's treatise on revolution, it also just breaks off, it gets interrupted or interrupts itself precisely at the moment when Lenin's turning to try and set out his own recounting of the history of the Russian revolutions from 1905 through to 1917 in a comparative perspective, this sort of sense of unfinished, but also of almost self-inflicted interruption, the one thing at the very core of Lenin's thought that cannot be discussed, as it were, because it needs to be concretely and historically lived. And then, of course, the incredibly wonderful quotation that he appends to the preface to the work when it is finally published, that I'm sure we've all reflected upon many times. He writes, "It's much more pleasant and useful to go through the experience of revolution than to write about it." Dual power, in a way, was itself also interrupted by the events of late 1917, however, and this is perhaps an element I'm not quite sure that we've thought through fully. The term dual power largely disappears from Lenin's writings as this sort of state of exception there in 1917 gets resolved in what we regard as a positive direction. And in the early years of the revolutionary government, he and Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries are then forced to confront very different political contexts and develop quite different languages to confront them. And indeed, we'll refer back to earlier languages of the Bolshevik tradition, particularly in terms of notions of hegemony, as Craig Brandis' work has very solidly demonstrated, to comprehend the challenges of those change conjunctures. So first we've got civil war raging round, and then as the counter-revolutionary tide has seemingly stemmed, the attempted hesitant, perhaps not too hesitant, construction of a socialist order under the new economic policy. All of these events see the Bolshevik grappling with and ultimately being defeated by the challenges of occupying the commanding heights, as it will be discussed at the time, of administrative authority in the absence of a powerful social movement from below. The invocation of the potentials and pitfalls of dual power in Lenin's writings thereby became, I think, in some senses, almost an anomaly in his thinking, without many precedents and not really moments of succession in his thought later on. Dual power was, in this sense, at least in Lenin's own thinking, less a finished concept than, as I suggested, a type of genial intuition, which necessarily is still marked by all these potentially very productive ambiguities. So a sort of insight that you have, that you're on to something, but don't have time to fully elaborate. And perhaps it's for that reason that the concept's been so fascinating for so many different subsequent Marxist traditions, and has been so open to a whole variety of different interpretations, reinterpretations, revisitations, and so forth, and perhaps also why it continues to fascinate us today. It's one of those concepts where the unfinished nature of history somehow seems to be sedimented in some particularly fertile form. How might such a perspective be reconstructed and actualized today? And putting this in the context of returning to the original question I'd posed in this talk, in what sense then can dual power be regarded as the outlines for an alternative to the main currents of understanding what politics is in the modern world, that is, in terms of a representative schema? Significant currents of contemporary radical thought have comprehended this power of a completely different type, the way Lenin formulates it in his original exploration of the notion, a power of a completely different type. Very significant currents of radical thought have thought of dual power as a moment of the sort of re-eruption of some type of repressed and originary constituent power. So I'm referring here in particular to the very creative reading of Lenin, championed in many different ways, in many different political conjunctures, by the recently sadly departed comrade Tony Negri. For Negri, dual power is sort of this moment where the repressed constituent power breaks out of all these constricting constitutional forms that have been imposed upon it, but somehow ones that could never hold back the ultimately sort of titanic force that inheres in dual power as a type of constituent power in itself. And it's quite interesting, I think, to see the way in which Negri's approach to reading Lenin in this fashion in the 1970s, in a work that was reprinted much later, but was originally entitled The Factory of Strategy, 33 Lessons on Lenin, published in 77, a significant year. Many of these ways in which Negri is reading Lenin in these terms will later on, a few years later, as he's finding himself in prison and grappling with what to do with his time and producing his quite stunning and hugely influential text on Spinoza, The Savage Anomaly, where he will formulate, and it's been contested by many Spinoza scholars, but formulate a very influential thesis of a fundamental distinction between potentia and potestas in Spinoza's thinking. And all sorts of different things have come out of that discussion. But in many ways, that type of opposition or that discussion that Negri initiates there in relation to Spinoza is preceded and is informed by the type of work that Negri has been doing on Lenin in the prior years, at the height of the subversive potential of movements in Italy in particular in the late 70s. So for this type of reading, a situation of dual power is regarded as the reassertion of a qualitatively distinct type of creative power, a constituent power that lies at the foundation of every constitutional order. Dual power in this sense, as constituent power, is a power that may be repressed or distorted or held in check for a period, but it can never be eradicated and can never be exhausted and will always come back to wreak its revenge. As a primordial force of innovation, and here in Negri's reading, it's very interesting to see the way in the 70s he's reading Lenin, but he's also engaging with themes that Pocock, from a very different political tradition, is elaborating in this period. And Negri will go on to do that in much greater detail later on in his work, explicitly focused on constituent power. Here, dealing with many themes related to forces of innovation. Constituent power as this sort of primordial force of innovation would function as some type of once present but now absent cause. It's passed into this new constitutional order, which, however, only the innovation proposed by constituent power has called forth. In some ways, it functions as a sort of hidden god, which has disappeared into its creation. Yet, insofar as posited as ontologically primary, constituent power, and conceiving of dual power as this type of constituent power, nevertheless, I think, subsists within the form over whose birth it had presided, as a latent threat of renewed innovation at the moment when the constitutional order, sooner or later, passes over into its moment of corruption. Understood in this way, dual power seems to represent a sort of fusion of a Marxist theory of the singularity of revolutionary crisis, which is always a novel overdetermination of many overdeterminations, with the fundamental presupposition of the natural law tradition, namely the ultimately generic and ontological foundation of political action and power. As said, an incredibly creative and inspiring reading, but one, I think, from which I ultimately dissent. While conceiving a situation of dual power in these terms as a sort of originary constituent power may enable us to posit its temporal and ontological primacy, a sort of dual power good because natural. This argument also destines dual power to dying soon after the day of its birth in ways that I think has not been fully thought through. As Lenin claimed, this type of interlocking of powers that occurred in 1917 cannot last long. A situation of dual power is, by definition, an exception to the normal functioning of sovereignty. and there may be very tempting notions circulating today around this. And I'm thinking in particular of Panagiotis Sotiris's very creative elaboration of notions of a situation, a prolonged situation of permanent dual power. Michael Bray as well has explored some of these important themes. I think ultimately this vision, that is a vision of autonomous institutions, of popular political organization, somehow subsisting alongside established forms of state power over a longer period. So you get a sort of protracted structural crisis, and you've got a situation of these autonomous institutions of popular political organization undertaking sort of guerrilla-like skirmishes or harassing the established power from the sidelines. As tempting as that argument is, it does not seem to me to resolve one of the fundamental paradoxes that lies at the heart of the notion of constituent power, and thus questions the viability of thinking constituent power as a way of understanding the specificity of dual power. And this is the paradox that constituent power can only be configured as such, that is, as constituent, and can only be recognized as a constituting power through reference to its formal and temporal difference from the constituted power at whose origin it is thought to lie, or at whose origin it is posited to lie. So there's a necessary dialectic between constituent power and constituted power that I don't think is fully thought through in the type of arguments that Negri presented in many different forms over many years. If we think this type of difference in dialectical terms, constituent power appears as fundamentally internal to the modern sovereign state, in the sense that it represents the historical and structural foundation that the consolidation of the state, the process of consolidation of the state, must sublate in that dual Hegelian sense of reciprocal and simultaneous cancellation and preservation. So understood in a dialectical sense, in a way, that reading of constituent power seems to me not to fully understand the extent to which it can be configured as a type of ruse on the way to constitutionalization. If we understand constituent power, on the other hand, as a sort of transcendental relation, that is, rather than a relation that precedes the constitutional order, we depict it as the posited condition of possibility of the existing constitutional order, working backwards and retrospectively determining it in a formalistic sense as a sort of absented cause. We end up with the same difficulty of the way in which constituent power would ultimately end up being devoured, as it were, or eaten up, converted to one of the instants or moments of sovereignty itself. In a situation of enduring or protracted dual power, the weakly emergent constituent power would necessarily remain structurally subaltern, in Gramsci's specific sense, to the established order. The longer such a situation of low intensity dual power, is a way we could think of it, a situation of low intensity dual power were to go on, the more opportunities constituted power would have to reassert itself as sole organizing political instance. And I think we see many examples of this negative dialectic going on in relation to many radical movements over the last 30 or 40 years in particular. So if we think about the growth and decline of some key radical movements over the last 30 years, we can see a movement from moments of containment to the slow constrictor-like exhaustion of movements in, for instance, all of the energies surrounding the initial Zapatista uprising and then the various pressures brought to bear on it over many years of low intensity warfare, open and closed by the Mexican state. We can also see it in the dissipation of the radical movements in the squares that had fueled the so-called Arab Spring, although obviously also with a much more constrictive boa constrictor moment coming through at the end of a certain cycle. And all then the reverberations of the way the constitutional order restores normality. And we saw in particularly stark forms in responses to the crushing of the Egyptian revolution, but also thinking in terms of the ongoing, and still in a parliamentary stable form, the situation in Turkey as examples of those dynamics. What such an ultimately ontological understanding of dual power also tends to obscure, however, is not only Lenin's emphasis upon the temporary and exceptional status of dual power. I think those readings also need to pass over the precise sense in which the Soviets, for Lenin, were a type of power of a completely different type. It was a power of a completely different type, not because it was incommensurable. It couldn't be measured against the powers claimed by the provisional government. A common measure, as Lenin clearly recognized, had in fact already been imposed by the conjuncture itself. Neither the Soviets nor the provisional government put themselves forward simply as some type of generic form of power, or to use some of Max Weber's terms, neither the Soviets nor the provisional government were claiming merely to be power in the sense of Macht, or in the sense of a mere capacity to act. Both of them were making much more specific and concrete claims. The provisional government certainly had. Lenin was encouraging the Soviets, as it were, to make explicit what he thought was implicit in their practice. Both were making claims to function as the concrete sovereign authority in that very particular concrete conjuncture in 1917. So to use Weber's terms again, both were making claims to represent the sole legitimate form of domination or of Herrschaft in that particular conjuncture. So they had also claims to being able to constrain actions on the part of others and other social groups, and to force those actions to be undertaken even when they were undertaken unwillingly. If the provisional government's decrees had been able to both to gain at least a passive or tacit consent, at least in the sense of not being actively opposed by strategically located sectors of the population, most probably the Soviets' pretensions, or the pretensions that Lenin is trying to encourage the Soviets increasingly to assume to represent an alternative governmental power, would not have endured for very long. The Soviets, for Lenin, instead constituted a power of a completely different type, both because of the way in which this power had, he argued, been produced, and crucially, because of the way in which it continued to function and should increasingly be encouraged to function precisely as an instance of sovereign authority, without any apologies for the claim. So firstly, in terms of its mode of production, on the one hand, the provisional government's claims were made entirely within the established paradigm of the production of modern sovereignty, with which we're all familiar. Legality guaranteed ultimately by a constitutional form within which legitimacy is produced by means of the representation, or as I prefer to pronounce it, the representation of the popular forces that the constitutional form had made absent. On the other hand, the Soviets inherited an old revolutionary tradition, one that extends a long way back before the Marxist tradition, that insisted upon the always revocable nature of political delegation, the continuous review of the implementation of the Soviets' decisions, that is, the articulation of executive, legislative, and administrative powers in an organic relation of mutual correction, constituted the basis for what was an always revisable form of political order, or in other words, of a continuous reordering based upon active popular participation in the political process. The Soviets and the provisional government were also fundamentally distinct in terms of their function, and the types of sovereign authority to which they were laying claim were fundamentally distinct in terms of how they functioned. The provisional government's increasingly fragile claim to represent a sovereign authority in the Russian social formation aimed fundamentally to assert the primacy of political command and regulation of a particular class over the entire social scene. And the permanence of order remained for it the goal of its exercise of political power. In other words, the particular power of the provisional government and which it aimed is that it aimed to maintain the existing order and its foundation in what can be variously called the rights or powers of private property conceived as a structuring principle of the public realm. The Soviets, on the other hand, were instead conceived in Lenin's argument not as a variant of this modern bourgeois representative state in a proper sense of the term, and the type of sovereign authority to which it laid claim therefore also lay beyond sovereign authority in the proper sense of the term. It was instead a relation of a nascent rupture with the fundamental logic of the modern state. The Soviets' assertion of sovereign authority was in this sense nothing more, nothing less, but nothing more in terms of its claims upon sovereignty than a negative move. It was a negation of their opponent's competing claim to it, and thus could be characterized as what I think is a type of negative or specular or even of vanishing sovereignty, a type of sovereignty that's claiming its sovereignty in order to put itself out of business. It was a refusal to recognize that there could be any higher power impeding the institutionalization of the continuous reordering that the Soviets continually enacted in the very nature of their functioning as institutions determined by popular political participation. And thus, in that sense, was a refusal of the possibility even of sovereignty itself being set above the activity of popular political participation, which remains always configured, as it were, the court of last appeal, infinitely revisable, infinitely open to revisitations, infinitely open to new decisions as the changing needs of popular energies are expressed, debated, and decided upon. The difference between the types of powers represented by the provisional government and the Soviets was therefore, in my view, neither a case of the incommensurability of two qualitatively distinct powers. So they had something in common, which is why they could measure up and fight things out. Nor was it a simple opposition of one power that gets set against another in a sort of symmetrical, antagonistic confrontation, as if it's a type of level playing field, and then ultimately who's ever strongest wins. So a mere excess of force then ultimately decides. The difference between them rather resided in the very nature and function of the type of sovereign authority that they represented, or in some ways sought not to represent in the case of the Soviets. So here I'd like to vary a formulation from Zavaleta in order to try and think through how to characterize this difference as the difference of the duality of dual power. Zavaleta preferred, in his works in the 70s, to use the notion of a duality of powers rather than dual power or double power. A whole variety of different translations into Spanish could have been used, but he quite explicitly flags up why he's using this particular translation of a duality of powers, because he wanted to emphasize that the revolutionary situation theorized by Lenin and for Zavaleta after him by Trotsky did not involve the bifurcation of a single classically unique power, as he called it, but instead it involved the emergence of two powers, two types of state, which were fundamentally incompatible in their mode of production and functioning. Zavaleta's theorization was influenced in particular, of course, by the experiences and discussions of dual power situations in the early 1970s, in the Popular Assembly in Bolivia, and perhaps most of all in that brief season of popular unity in Chile, upon which he reflects in a tragic mode in the postface that he attaches to some of his writings after, I guess, what we should call the first 9/11. By taking up again today the notion of a duality of dual power, or reconfiguring that slightly, what I'm seeking to emphasize is the disequilibrium between the two powers contending to occupy the place of sovereign authority in 1917. One power, the provisional government, sought sovereign power in order to maintain it and to reproduce it, sovereign power as an end in its sense. So to use terminology that's used by both Zavaleta and by Poulantzas, it was sovereignty conceived as a unitary power that aimed to condense within itself and thereby to regulate all potential social conflicts. So a very strong tie back to the Hobbesian formulation of sovereignty. The other power, the one embodied in the Soviets, on the other hand, did indeed seek to occupy the normal place of sovereignty. We see that quite concretely in the seizure of the Winter Palace, quite directly. But the goal of that seizure was not the goal of taking power in order to maintain that power or in order to maintain the existing sovereign system. The goal was instead to disable. It was a seizure undertaken in order to disable the normal functioning, not only of the provisional government, but of sovereign authority as such, and thereby to open up the space that would allow the already functioning alternative power of the Soviets to expand. So it involved in some ways occupying the place of sovereign power in order to dissolve it into the non-place of a political relation of continual socio-political reordering by active popular participation in the political process. It was in this precise sense, I think, that Lenin's slogan, the famous slogan, "All power to the Soviets," really has an historically concrete and explosive and literal meaning. It literally means all power to the Soviets to prevent the emergence of any other possible pole of power attraction in the society that could represent a threat to the novel experimentation in popular political power that the Soviets are undertaking. Janus faced the Soviets both did and did not participate in the paradigm of modern sovereignty, would be my argument. But here, in some ways, was the terrifying gambit that events had forced the Bolsheviks to play. By insisting that the time was right to assume governmental responsibility with the insurrection of October and the dissolution of even the formality of the provisional government, which had largely been disabled through its own incompetence beforehand anyway. With this insurrection, the Bolsheviks were gambling that the political relationality and immediacy of active popular participation in the Soviets, the sort of working government of the Paris Commune type, as Lenin continuously recalls, would have the capacity to sustain the continuance of a sort of deconstructive dissolution of sovereignty, like whacking moles on the head each time they popped up in those video games some of us may have played back in the 80s or so. Throughout the setbacks and reversals that quickly followed October, all the way through the Civil War, finding a new path in the new economic policy, a reformulation of a politics of the United Front as an attempted internal cultural revolution to reignite the revolutionary process in Russia itself. The Russian revolutionary process was marked by, I think, increasingly frantic attempts. And in Lenin's life, it's marked by increasingly frantic attempts to recapture this almost utopian moment, this fragile vision and experience when there really is another type of politics emerging. And then, of course, as we all know, is tragically swept away definitively by the restoration of the naked absolutist sovereignty of Stalin's counter-revolution. Stalin, who perhaps should go down as one of Thomas Hobbes's finest and most practical readers. Isolated in the commanding heights of sovereign state power, the original experience of the duality of dual power in the Russian Revolution proved ultimately unable to prevent the return of representative political society. That is, the reaffirmation of the primacy of organization over and above association. It was an experience repeated so often at the end of all the other great popular uprisings throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, that few today even consider the dissolution of politics in this sense, of political society, of sovereign authority, as anything but utopian, as anything but deleterious in a utopian sense, in a very negative characterization of the strengths of the utopian tradition. So is it still possible today to chart paths that might be able to resist the seemingly almost inevitable return of the politics of the party of representative order? Concrete responses to this question, of course, can only be proposed by and within the actual movements of struggles as they get underway. And in many respects, it's these concrete responses that constitutes the fundamental task of any movement of popular participation and struggle as they get underway. In our own times, as I've argued elsewhere, we have been surrounded by movements that are arguably much more vibrant and creative than is often thought, and can be characterized by their continuous re-emergence over a long cycle, over the last 30 years at least, of a continuous re-emergence of new radical initiatives, which, while they may not have won any great immediate victories on their own terms, nevertheless have fundamentally shifted the capacities and potentials and resources of hope for the radical politics to come. Lenin's proposal of a politics of another type, I think, provides us then with a crucial message in a bottle. It arrives down to us today, something to take forward and bequeath to future generations. And I think I try and summarize this very telegraphically as a reminder of 4 key principles that should inform and accompany all such attempts to repose these questions and find concrete responses to them in future political struggles, as sort of critical touchstones that we constantly need to come back to and to check each of our initiatives. So first, politics, as it is currently constituted in its official forms, and I'm including here all forms of politics, even and especially leftist, oppositional, revolutionary politics, is not in itself necessarily an antidote to what I've also elsewhere characterized as the subalternization that forms, as it were, the formal cause of political modernity itself. In politics' usual reliance on a logic of the absenting of popular and subaltern demands and their subsequent representation in the hierarchies of command that are condensed in the political and also juridical fields, politics is one of the most potent mechanisms for generalizing and normalizing the experience of subalternity across the entire social field. So a revolutionary politics that is content with its status as politics is not enough. A revolutionary politics on this reading also needs to constantly press to revolutionize our understanding of what politics itself is and can be. Second key touchstone to derive from Lenin's outline of an alternative. To engage in radical politics today, I think, means, as always, that we do so in the full awareness not only of the limits of bourgeois politics, official politics, institutional politics, but also of the fact that politics as we know it, also our own politics, remains an expression of the problems our movements aim to solve. We, good subalterns, are also the inheritors of the experience of subalternization, and much of what we struggle against is not only the legacies of our enemies, but also the internalization of those defeats in ourselves. I'm sure we're all aware that hierarchies of command, claims to prestige or predominance by restricted or restricting groups, all sorts of practices of pacification, structural blockages on energies and attitudes, these aren't experiences that are purely confined to the realm of bourgeois politics. They're ones that have also virally infected so many different oppositional political cultures. They're ones that remain present with us today, and therefore a perpetual struggle against them as a core dimension of the movements unfolding themselves will remain always a key dimension, a critical capacity by means of which a genuinely revolutionary politics distinguishes itself from those forms of politics that sooner or later will ultimately be devoured by a politics of order. Third touchstone to take from Lenin's message in a bottle. Politics itself, no matter how important politics is, will never be enough. The type of politics that does not reinforce the subordination of association to organization, upon which political modernity rests, remains, as always, a project for the future. It's not a legacy readily available to us or something we've already got worked out. So simply attempting to be more political within the confines of many of our current practices of politics will not in itself be enough. What is decisive, as Lenin teaches us, is the type of politics in which emancipatory political movements engage in their process of radicalization, elaboration, and communication and inheritance. And that's both in relation to the existing political structures, but also crucially, I think, also in terms of how we innovate new political structures inside our own revolutionary traditions in the concrete practice of contemporary movements. Finally, then, a fourth Leninist touchstone to which we should continuously return. No politicization without de-subalternization, conceived as the concrete critique of representation in both a narrow and a broad sense. That is, both as institutional form and as perspective or orientation. The fundamental challenge for revolutionary politics today, it seems to me, does not consist in attempting to politicize a whole series of demands that are merely social, as if we revolutionaries wait along on the sidelines for various social demands to emerge, which we can then so benevolently politicize. The fundamental challenge is not the representation of social rebellion at the political level. We already have a whole wide range of creative movements underway that are practically demonstrating the extent to which political relations of force already traverse all social instances. And here, very telegraphically, just to indicate what I'm thinking about, we merely need to think about the experience of the explosion of anti-racist struggles, of feminist struggles, of struggles against global apartheid, particularly in the situation in Palestine today, to see the way in which supposedly social instances already possess moments of their own political force that need to be valorized and grow. It is the form and practice of politicization as de-subalternization within these movements of rebellion and struggle themselves that will determine their capacity to grow. And it's up to the revolutionary traditions to be adequate to them and not the other way around. The concrete critique of representation as a governing logic of political action by means of experimentation in alternative practices of delegation, of popular empowerment, and of active popular participation constitutes for us today, I think, one of the first steps our generation can take towards generating such a de-subalternizing politics of another type, which would be both capable of and worthy of inheriting Lenin's radical and still radically alternative proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that excellent, highly stimulating paper. It's worth perhaps also mentioning that the book Peter mentions by Zavaleta on dual power, written in Spanish, is one of the titles. It's one of the two only books, I think, which deals explicitly with the question of dual power. I think the other one is by an Italian, Riccardo Guastini. But I mean, in the post 1917 tradition. And that book by Zavaleta is a book we're hoping to include in the historical materialism book series translated by Bruno Bostiels. Okay, so we have a whole series of questions already coming in, which is excellent. So I suggest we take them a couple at a time. Peter, is that all right with you?
Yeah, that's
all right.
good.
Yeah. Okay, so we have firstly a question from
Ed Sid.
Ed Sid, yeah, just trying to find the question now. Okay, yeah. Ed Sid asked the following question. I have doubts whether this dual power concept relates to Gramsci's counter-hegemony concept as challenging the already existing dominance of the hegemonic group, question mark. So the relationship of dual power to the notion of counter-hegemony. And then the second question from Peter Hallwood. He has a question about the relationship between dual power per se and the mass or proletarian power of the kind Lenin associates with the Paris Commune. So what is the relationship between dual power per se and mass or proletarian power of the kind Lenin associates with the Paris Commune? Should we come back on those two first, Peter?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just taking notes down, looking through the chat. So on the first question, counter-hegemony has often been associated with Gramsci. It's not actually a concept that Gramsci himself uses. It's in subsequent traditions that have developed that as a reading of Gramsci to talk about notions of counter-hegemony. And I think there are some difficulties with the way that has been developed, because in particular, it tends to reinsert the way Gramsci developed the Bolshevik discussion of hegemony back within a sovereigntist frame. So the discourses around counter-hegemony tend to assume this hegemony as one type of power and counter-hegemony as that which counters it, and then they fight things out and force, as it were, decides. It's sort of militarized parliamentarianism, if you want. Now, that's not really the way Gramsci's thinking about political practices of hegemony. And he's much more interested, following the Bolshevik discussions, in understanding hegemony as a particular type of political leadership, of a relationship between different oppressed social groups and of their capacity to work together in projects of liberation. So as it were, hegemony for Gramsci is much more focused on valorizing and increasing the capacity of what he calls the subaltern social groups, or if you want, the working class or oppressed classes in the broadest sense. Again, very closely aligned to, I think, Lenin's thinking of relations between oppressed classes. It's much more about building their internal capacity to act and less concerned with the process of countering some hegemon figure. The necessary consequence of building the capacity to act of subaltern social groups is their empowerment to engage in revolutionary struggle against constituted power, but it's not defined in an oppositional dialectic in that way. The question posed around dual power is an important one, and the relationship between dual power to mass or proletarian power, and as Lenin talks about it. What I'd emphasize is dual power for Lenin is the situation that emerges. It's not the type of power in itself. The situation is one of dual power. We have the emergence of these quite radically different powers operating and contesting on the same terrain. And precisely mass or proletarian power is one of the powers functioning in that dual power situation. And as I've tried to suggest, functioning in a way that falls outside the type of sovereigntist frame that ultimately defines the types of power represented by the provisional government in that period, which is also why dual power is not something that can be willed. It's a situation that's given to be, that, as it were, the conjuncture throws up. But even that's expressing it too abstractly, because that situation is only thrown up by the conjuncture on the basis of the cultures and practices of popular empowerment and participation already moving and being underway to produce that situation where there is an interlocking of two dictatorships. And that, I think, is crucial for thinking through that when Lenin's theorizing, we say theorizing, but when he's using the words a couple of times in this period, he's not saying, you know, here's an alternative, pick this up. He's saying, here's concretely what history presents us with. How do we relate to it? How do we resolve to it? How can we understand the structure and nature of this conjuncture and act meaningfully within it? And so mass or proletarian power, whichever of the terms we use, are a fundamental component in resolving a situation of dual power in what Lenin would regard as the revolutionary direction.
Thanks. So a couple of other questions. So firstly, from Savas Michael Matsas. His question is, what is the relationship between dual power as a specific transition in 1917 and the withering away of the state, which is central in Lenin's State and Revolution? So what is the relationship between dual power as a specific transition in 1917 and the withering away of the state, which is central in Lenin's State and Revolution? And then a question from Mark James Leger. His question is, Lenin, on the three sources of Marxism, would not think the autonomy of politics without reference to political economy and philosophy. Viz. Freud, the repressed never returns in the same guise. So Lenin, on the three sources of Marxism, would not think the autonomy of politics without reference to political economy and philosophy. Viz. Freud, the repressed never returns in the same guise. Not sure whether that was a question or a comment, but maybe read out another question from Leoncio Pazmino. Dual power would be equivalent to the processes of direct democracy via a constituent assembly of full powers to reformulate in a profound, integral, and structural way the constituted legal order, but with the active participation of the workers and the people. Otherwise, it would be equivalent to a traditional formal constitutional change and would not be an emancipatory. So dual power would be an equivalent to the processes of direct democracy via a constituent assembly of full powers to reformulate in a profound, integral, and structural way the constituted legal order, but with the active participation of the workers and the people. Otherwise, it would be equivalent to a traditional formal constitutional change and would not be emancipatory.
Okay, thank you. So starting with the first question regarding the relation between dual power and the withering away of the state, because Lenin formulates the notion of dual power there in early 1917, and then takes off to the Finnish countryside and is scribbling away and taking up work he's done before and thinking through what gets translated in English as a withering away of the state, but tracking back through the references, you find a sort of sense of maybe the state going to sleep, the state going into a slumber or becoming redundant. So a lot of what he's exploring in 1917 is thinking through the way in which sovereign state power is extinguished, if we want to use another metaphor, and how a situation of dual power has posed that concretely. And it's really interesting that he conducts that thought experiment as he's been doing in previous years. And he's sitting there in Zurich, he goes back to the science of logic, taking notes on Hegel to make sense of the war. He's there in the midst of a revolution, and we're going back to texts on the Paris Commune. You're taking your notes and trying to clarify what is the nature of the state and how it functions, because he's trying to get a grip what sort of power is the Soviets represent and how do they take and resolve the situation of dual power in a revolutionary direction. So there's an important moment then that the process we often call the withering away of the state, the dissolution of the state, the going to sleep of the state, when you track these formulations back to Engels, is developed on the basis of Lenin's perception of this conjunctural moment of dual power, which opens up the opportunity then to think through the state's superannuation or replacement, so forth. I'm not entirely sure around the question around Lenin's three sources, but I suppose I'd say here that the reference to Freud in a way is useful, because for Lenin as well, history is about those unexpected moments and knowing how to work and operate within them. And revolutionary crises can occur in different forms and lead to different possibilities being realized. And it's maybe one of the things that we missed out on, given that Lenin never got round to doing that comparative study of the 1905-1917 revolutions, because he was too busy actually making another one, of seeing the way in which precisely the repressed never returns in the same guise, but those revolutionary moments and opening up of those potentials and possibilities can occur due to different configurations. But then structurally, those moments will have a certain logic inhering in them. And I think strongly for Lenin, driving that forward is that experience of understanding, stabilizing the potential for popular political engagement and participation. And what fascinates him about the Soviets is the way this represents an institutional form to expand that as a way of doing politics across the society. That's one of those moments, or the common elements, as it were, that reemerges in that sense of the reemergence of the repressed. In terms of then talking around direct democracy via constituent assemblies, I think that's certainly a pathway that opens up with Lenin's reflection. Constituent assemblies have gone in different directions throughout the 20th century in different contexts, and often they've functioned in the sense of this type of constituent power, which is then eaten up inside a new constitutional order. What Lenin's interested in exploring is something that opened up much more radically in that period of dual power, and what made it a genuine interlocking of two dictatorships, of powers of different types, and a politics of a different type. It's precisely because the type of popular political participation and empowerment embodied in the historical experience of the Soviets seemed to Lenin a way of continuously revisiting what politics itself means. So the debate's never up, the decision's not taken, it's going to be revisited. Doing away with forms of officialdom, of formalized representation, and a return to structures of delegacy, the enabler of popular control at each moment in a shifting and changing conjuncture, is a crucial element in that process, but it's not one to be limited, because it becomes central to the whole conceptions of the democratic debate and discussions in the Soviets as an ongoing, regular occurrence in the type of society that emerges in that process. So when we talk about direct democracy, there are various oppositions then to formalized democracy, representative democracy. That's fine, but I think we need to really include this active, conscious participation dimension in that process to understand what Lenin's driving at, that politics in that vision is no longer configured as an instance of social command or authority. Politics becomes a way in which the society itself functions and reflects upon itself and resolves and deals through all the inevitable differences human beings are going to have living together, but by creating an institutional space that can accommodate that and that enables that to be discussed out, debated out, and decided upon and revisited on the largest mass basis possible, you have all the necessary checks and balances, as it were, of public scrutiny built in to the political process itself. I think that was those three. Sorry, I can't see the chat quite so immediately.
That's fine. Couple of other questions then. First from Paul LeBlanc. In Larsley's book, Bread and Authority, a frustrated Bolshevik functionary says, "They say that the voice of the people is the voice of God. We hearkened to the voice of the people. but what came of it? The most pathetic results possible. How does this fit in with what you have outlined? So in Lars Lee's Bread and Authority, a frustrated Bolshevik functionary says, they say that the voice of the people is the voice of God. We hearkened to the voice of the people, but what came of it? The most pathetic results possible. How does this fit with what you've outlined? And then we have Christopher Reed, who asks, many historians now argue that the concept of dual power as it existed in 1917 is a great oversimplification which conceals actual processes of the melting away of all national and state power and the emergence of a myriad of local organs of self-government. Multiple power has been proposed instead. Does the fact that there was no real dual power make a difference to your argument? So many historians now argue that the concept of dual power as it existed in 1917 is a great oversimplification which conceals actual processes of the melting away of all national and state power and the emergence of a myriad of local organs of self-government. I think that's perhaps also a reference to Mark Farrow's book on the bureaucratization of the Russian Revolution, who talks about multiplication of different forms of self-government. Multiple power has been proposed instead. Does the fact that there was no real dual power make any difference to your argument? Mehmet asks, is the purpose of political hegemony to establish dual power, or can dual power occur in another way? Is the purpose of political hegemony to establish dual power, or can dual power occur in another way?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So dual power, as I've outlined for Lenin, can be a particular situation where you have the emergence of a type of politics that represents an alternative to politics in a sovereigntist frame. Hegemony as a political practice may be one way of getting there. There can be others. What's crucial is the emergence of these powers of a completely different type and political practices that could represent a viably alternative form of social and political organization in any given particular society. I've argued elsewhere, thinking about hegemony, we sometimes think about hegemony as a thing, it's a thing you win, to win hegemony. We use these sorts of phrases. I think that's one of the ways you can use the word hegemony. There's a tradition around that. That's fine. But I think hegemony is most fruitful and most useful to us when we think about hegemony as a method or a way of doing politics. And it's fundamentally a method and a way of doing politics that seeks to increase the capacity to act politically of the oppressed classes. So it's looking for ways of teaching people, of bequeathing traditions, of understanding processes, of bringing people along on a journey to increase their capacity to engage meaningfully in political struggle and in political deliberation. In that sense, hegemony is a politicizing process, or maybe we could refer to it as a process of institutionalized radicalization. That's one of the pathways through to a situation of dual power, and you could argue that it'd be hard to see how we'd get to a situation where you'd have that confrontation between sovereign power in the bourgeois sense and a radical revolutionary alternative to it without a process in some ways similar to what I've been talking about. But I'd emphasize again, dual power is one of these moments. It's the situation we're dealing with, and it can be resolved in a whole range of different ways. What's going to determine the direction of its resolution is the quality of the political formation and leadership and hegemony that's available in that particular conjuncture in order to push the relations of force in a revolutionary direction. On the point that Paul lays in relation to Lars's Bread of Authority, yeah, we all know it. Pathetic results, story of our lives, in a sense, defeat's never all that much fun. But what's the alternative, in a sense? We hearken to the voice of the people. We've been disappointed before, we will be disappointed again, but what other alternatives are there? And there is the element, I always go back to Rosa Luxemburg talking about the defeats of revolutionary politics as in some ways integral to revolutionary politics. We go back to that as the foundation. And perhaps it's a question historically, a sort of self-critical view of the defeats of previous revolutionary movements, to think through what were the potentials and the resources that those moments neglected, that had they attended to them, may have strengthened them and, if not prevented, attenuated the defeat or made other outcomes more likely, as a process not of trying to revise history or whitewash it, but as thinking through, well, what lessons can be learnt from these defeats and how do we increase the capacity to listen to the voice, as it were. Maybe it's better to say not of the people in a unitary sense, but of the peoples and all the whole wide range of conflicting perspectives you're going to find always in human communities, and nowhere more so than amongst a whole variety of different experiences and perspectives on oppression, thinking through the voices of the people and how they're activated and how they're brought together in some form that even and especially in all the forms of conflict and difference they'll have, can find a way to expand that space of active popular participation in the political process. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And it's not natural, in a sense, to find ways of working together in the interests of each and everyone's liberation, even and especially in the necessary differences between them. But I think that's the real challenge and struggle for revolutionary politics, and what sets it out as different from other forms of established politics. On this point, I suppose I refer back to quite a famous saying. It was attributed to a group of Murri women, so Aboriginal women from Australia in the 1970s. And something when I first heard as a young leftist teenager, I found really inspiring. And each time I go back to it, again, I sort of think of it as one of the most revolutionary propositions I've ever heard. And in some ways, I think also one of the most Leninist conceptions of political struggle. So the saying with something like this, and picture here, this is a group of Aboriginal people who have been subject to one of the worst genocides in human history, and the ongoing struggles of that, speaking quite directly to political activists, very left-wing political activists from a white Australian background, and saying, look, if you've come here to our movement in order to help us, as a sort of act of charity, but you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because you've sensed that your liberation is somehow bound up with ours, well, then let's find a way for us to work and struggle together. And it's that impetus, I think, of thinking through the way in which the spaces for political activation of the popular classes, in their differences and in their struggles, that becomes what revolutionary politics, it seems to me, really is all about. The third question we had highlighted around dual power is a great oversimplification, and if multiple power might be preferable. Yeah, of course, the concept of dual power is a great oversimplification. That's what great concepts do for us. They enable us to cut through all of that soggy grey stuff that gets in the way in real life and actually start posing the question on the basis of principles, to make things black and white, as it were, to determine where the choices are. So dual power, we can question historically, did this occur? Was there this movement between them? Could it be characterized in a different way? Were there a whole variety of different types of powers emerging? And empirically, we can investigate different instances. At the end of that process, we're still then going to need to do the theoretical or conceptual work of talking about the principles that were informing those different multiple powers. And one of the things that I find particularly fascinating about Lenin's argument is that he configures the notion of dual power in such a way that it's this qualitative difference between the types of powers, their mode of production and their functioning, between the experience Lenin is claiming to be embodied in the Soviets, and maybe empirically it wasn't fully, you know, maybe he's pushing it a bit. Okay, fine. But the principle is established of this qualitative difference and the image of the Soviets as representing an alternative form of popular empowerment and political participation against the way in which the type of politics promoted by the provisional government was thoroughly within the established framework of modern sovereignty. So Lenin's characterization, I think, should be judged for its brilliance as a conceptual intervention, which, like all the best conceptual interventions, may not tell the whole truth, but maybe also it tells the most important truth that's sitting there present. That's something that we can take up and work with. And then, because it's a concept, it's what concepts do. They help us to translate experiences from one context into another, which doesn't ever mean to replicate them, but it means to translate them and think through how experiences from the past or other contexts can help us to understand the type of challenges we confront in the present. And that's where I really see the brilliance, the genial insight Lenin has, and the way he's trying to think through the revolutionary potentials that are there in that particular moment.
Thanks. So we have a question from Jason Dorsey, who says, you've noted several times Lenin's engagement with the history of the Paris Commune in his thinking during 1917. What do you make of the way Lenin drew negative lessons from the Paris Commune from 1917 forward? So you've noted several times Lenin's engagement with the history of the Paris Commune in his thinking during 1917. What do you make of the way Lenin drew negative lessons from the Paris Commune from 1917 onwards? Then we have a question from Andre, who says, since you're bringing in Spinoza, you got me thinking, the primitive church also had to grapple with the notion of dual power. Number one, you can't serve two masters, God and Mammon, and number two, give Caesar what belongs to Caesar and God what belongs to God. Also considering the earthly authority as a transitional order. Considering the conflictive nature and transitional nature of Lenin's notion of dual power, to what extent do you think Lenin retrieves or challenges that concept from the Christian tradition? Also, could you please repeat the context in which you used the Zapatistas as an example? I missed that part of the argument. So to what extent Lenin's concept of dual power retrieves or challenges the Christian concept of God and versus Mammon, and give Caesar what belongs to Caesar and God what belongs to God. And then repeat what you said about the Zapatistas. And then from Magdalena Leon, the advances of feminist struggles are premised on the politicization of their interpretations and actions. In what sense do we politicize processes that are already assumed to be political and emancipatory? So the advances of feminist struggles are premised on the politicization of their interpretations and actions. In what sense do we politicize processes that are already assumed to be political and emancipatory?
Well, then I'd love to ask a question, Peter, if you don't mind. I think it's a very sympathetic account, of this de-subalternizing politics and the call for mass participation and so on. But I don't see that as an either or with accounts of sovereignty. So I wanted just to ask and have kind of three little parts of the question. One is going back to this question of dual power or Soviet power or mass power, however you want to call it. They do seem like they're different things. When Lenin talks about dual power, it seems to me he always means divided power. And that right from the beginning, the first time he mentions it, it's, as you said, it's something that's temporary and exceptional, and also something that we need to get out of as quickly as possible. We need to persuade people, show people why this is not a stable situation, and instead get people to move as quickly as possible to a single power, an undivided working class, popular mass power. But for the moment, people haven't understood this, so we need to, explain until they get it. And by the time we get to October, people have understood. So it always seems like he's very consistent. From every time he talks about dual power, it's something to escape and get out of. It's a kind of temporary impasse. And then the critical question is the power that he does, the bulk of your discussion, I think, is the power that he does absolutely affirm, which is this popular mass Soviet power on the model, again, of the Paris Commune. The question is, what's its relation to sovereignty? And there, I think it's questionable because it's revolutionary, and I think he, as you said, and I think he adopts from Engels and others that a revolution is authoritarian. It has to be. It involves one set of people imposing their will on another, and it always involves violence and civil war, right? He will emphasize the fact that revolution means civil war, and civil war means power to win that war. And so it's not an abstract second thing that comes along. It's like built right into the concept of revolution. And then the second thing, and the final thing is, does it involve sovereignty then? Does it involve, in other words, the power to command? And I think it absolutely does. I think it's very emphatic. I mean, right from the moment that Soviet power is established, it imposes order number one. It asserts a kind of sovereignty already in the spring. And then by the time you get to October, those initial decrees and then the consequences of them are issued as commands, precisely to overrule the alternative, the bourgeois dictatorship, right? As you said, the class forces arrayed against it. And I think both in State and Revolution and then in practice in the autumn of 1917, and then very emphatically after that, it's about who can command who. The whom really is about that. And I think to dissociate the appealing mass popular participation from the implacable fact of class struggle and who will command who distorts Lenin's thinking, the unity of Lenin's thinking. You started very well, I think, by saying that Lenin is a complicated whole and it wouldn't make a lot of sense to dissociate, say, the authoritarian side of Lenin around party discipline from the more anarchistic side. We need to think them together. But isn't that the challenge, in a way, for what you're discussing, that we need to think both that mass participation side that you've brought out with the implacable fact of class struggle that you brought out, and that also Lars Lees brings out when he associates Lenin and not just Stalin, but with Hobbes, for example. So sorry, that was a long intervention, but I'm curious to know what you make of that.
Go ahead, Peter, and any final comments you want to add?
Yes, there's a lot of meat on the barbecue, as we say. I'll just go through the ones from the chat first and come to Peter's very stimulating comments, and maybe somewhere in the back of my brain I'll come up with an answer to it while doing so. But regarding, so Jason had asked here, the negative lessons Lenin drew from the Paris Commune. And there, in some ways, Lenin on that front, he's following a reading we get through Marx and Engels, and there's a clearly established tradition. We know what the limitations of the Paris Commune were. You know, lack of taking the threats seriously, lack of centralization, etc., lack of acknowledgement of the decisiveness of a form of authority in order to counter external enemies and threats and so forward. So on that front, as a reading or conceptually, I don't know how much new that Lenin is introducing there. And that's often the case in a lot of Lenin's exegetical style texts, that, you know, he's taking notes on other stuff. He's inheriting a tradition. He's always concerned to situate his readings as, you know, in the spirit of true Marxism, the true inheritance, and set them off in that way. So it's not surprising at all that, you know, everything he's dealing with might be done in an original or innovative format. It's perfectly adequate for his purposes to inherit that tradition and take it forward. And I think in some ways his reflections around the failings of the Paris Commune precisely do that, of carrying forward what he sees as correct in that tradition of Marxist critique. But that might be something for me to revisit and think if there's something more genial or unexpected going on in relation to those themes as well. On the question, okay, so in relation to dual power in the early church, I mean, it's a very interesting theme that could be, you know, has been explored by a number of thinkers and could be taken in a lot of different directions. And before the Constantinian turn, as it were, the compromise with state power, there's been all sorts of things going on. But even earlier, and the whole experience of Paul in some ways is one of institutionally getting under control the type of fanaticism that this new movement has unleashed and setting up the institutional structures. And so it comes down in the experience of the early church, the various Augustinian formulations within and against, in this world but not of it, types of areas. It's sort of picked up later on by Italian workerism and some odd traditions of affiliation, and it constitutes one of the driving motives, as it were, for the dissolution of the revolutionary potential of certain currents of Christianity in its institutionalization over centuries. But interestingly, then, it gets reposed when the idea of alternative principles come along in various forms of liberation theology and breaking out of those bounds. So there's certainly something going on there you could see as structurally similar to the problem Lenin's discussing in terms of the interlinking or interlocking, a contestation of the same terrain, but from quite radically opposed perspectives. And regarding the Zapatistas, I was noting that in terms of the limitations of a theory of a situation of sort of protracted dual power or of enduring dual power, as if in the absence of some immediate revolutionary victories, we could take consolation in the thought that over time we were building up our own sort of counter culture of resistance. I think the experience that occurred in terms of the steady strangulation of the radicalness of the Zapatista movement is one of the indications of the fact that dual power is not configured in that way. It's not designed. Conceptually, it can't function over a longer period of time. It's entirely temporary, and it needs to be decided upon, and will be decided upon one way or not, depending on the interventions. So my reference to the Zapatistas was a way of thinking through why perhaps notions of building up a counterpower elsewhere would not be one that I think is useful to recommend. The real appropriateness of Lenin's intervention is thinking through what happens in the precise moment of the revolutionary crisis, and you get posed with the question of one way or the other. And that's where his concept of dual power, I think, and the principles he elaborates in the qualitatively different types of powers operative there, while they are alternatives, becomes so interesting to reflect upon. Regarding politicization and feminist struggles, and you're asking in what sense, Magdalena asks, in what sense do we politicize processes that are already assumed to be political and emancipatory? I think this is an important dimension for revolutionary traditions to reflect upon. We don't politicize many contemporary social and political movements, which are already going through processes of intense politicization. And so the revolutionary left sometimes maybe still has a tendency, depending upon how dogmatic you want to get, of approaching emergent political movements in the sense of juniors who need to be tutored or to be politicized or brought within the fold of genuine revolutionary traditions. And I think that's precisely the sort of sectarian way it's entirely unproductive for those schooled in different revolutionary traditions, willing to contribute to them, for them to be relating to those types of movements. Lots of contemporary feminist struggles have demonstrated that not only that they're already politicized, but they're more politicized perhaps around some more fundamentally and politically significant issues, strategically important issues today than perhaps some more traditional forms of leftism, or those who think of themselves as more traditional forms of leftism have been able to achieve. So the real question is thinking about the valorization of the existing moments of politicization within movements as the way in which those with affiliations to revolutionary traditions can most usefully relate to all those new waves of struggles as they emerge. So speaking with those movements precisely as comrades, and as people joining in and traveling on the same path together. I'm not sure, was that all? I think that was all the questions from the chat. So on to Peter's $1 million question, as it were. The temporary nature of dual power is decisive for the way Lenin thinks about this issue. And you're right to say that one ways of translating the terms here would be in terms of a divided power, in a way, a doubled or a redoubled power. And what's decisive for me about the way he thinks this through is in terms of the types of power he sees operating in the different institutions of the Soviets and the provisional government and the established order. And as I noted, Lenin's perfectly happy to say the Soviets are making a claim for sovereign authority in this instance. It's going to be them saying what happens, or it's going to be the provisional government. So there's a very clear claim to sovereignty there. But the question becomes this: what's the goal of the Soviets' claim of that sovereignty? Now, the goal of sovereignty, traditionally understood from Budgen to Hobbes onwards, has been in order to affirm itself. So in Hobbes, you get the whole thing, okay, you enter in to the Leviathan, that's it. You've got your covenant, you're entered in, that's it. You're now in it. There is no possible dissent that is possible. You're immediately out if that's it. Sovereign authority is total and absolute and undivided. It's a very clear sense where sovereignty works in order to affirm itself. The goal of sovereignty is to be sovereign. Now, what are the Soviets doing? The Soviets are using sovereign authority in order to crush their enemies. They're using sovereign authority in order to prevent sovereign authority from preventing the expansion of popular participation and empowerment in the Soviets. That seems to me quite a different type of thing. I think what goes on under Stalinism is a reversion to the standard model of sovereigntist politics, and that's the death of the revolution. But the type of process and potentials that Lenin sees in the Soviets is a use of sovereign authority in order to undo the presuppositions of sovereignty. Because that sovereign authority has been used, it's being directed, as it were, externally, if you want, in a relationship of war, rather than politics, with all the complications around those. But it's being a sovereign authority that's used in order to deconstruct the capacity for a sovereigntist model of politics to regulate the way the Soviets themselves do politics. Because the moment the Soviets start limiting popular participation and empowerment in the Soviet structures, as Rosa Luxemburg knew all too well, the moment that happens, well, the Soviets are over. They're no longer Soviets. The Soviets are only Soviets in a substantive sense, insofar as they continue actively to embody that process of popular empowerment and engagement. And I think that's a decisive and key conception for us to use to reflect upon the defeats of the revolutionary movement in the 20th century. Some of them, which were also self-inflicted defeats. And Lenin provides us there with the outlines, as I've said, an alternative, another way of conceiving of the nature of politics. So the claim, I would argue, he sees in that moment of dual power is the Soviets' bid to occupy, what I call to occupy the place of sovereignty, as it were, in order to undo it, in order to deconstruct it, in order to make sovereign power, in a sense, redundant, because popular participation and empowerment expands to such an extent that the use of instances of authority in political processes throughout the social formation no longer have the same capacity to command and direct, because what commands and directs everyone, what occupies that space, is the collective deliberation, discussion, disagreement, resolution of the peoples themselves. So that's my attempt, as it were, to think through and knit together, if you want, the anarchistic Lenin and the authoritarian Lenin in a way that I think, when we think about the way those problems get reposed in the ebb and flood of different political movements today, in processes of radicalization, how movements come up and down, they get institutionally ossified, they fall away. I mean, leftist organizations do this. What are the sort of practices that we can put in place and the traditions we can inherit that provide some check and balance against that? And the way Lenin, it's just an outline, it's just a genial insight, the way he's trying to think about what's distinctive about how the Soviets can respond in that dual power situation, I think remains one of the most fascinating ways for us to try and track our ways into an enabling future.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's excellent. There is a final question which I'll read out, and you can choose to answer or not. given that we're very close to the end, which is from Florencia Campagna. The identity-based social movements succeeded in establishing a vision that became dominant, that of the transversality of race, class, and gender. Is it possible to build from there an anti-capitalist process and devise from there a counter-hegemony? The identity-based social movements succeeded in establishing a vision that became dominant, that of a transversality of race, class, and gender. Is it possible to build from there an anti-capitalist process and devise from there a counter-hegemony? Do you want to respond to that, or that
Yeah,
was me?
I mean, just briefly, I mean, obviously it's a big area of discussion that's been going on for a long time, maybe sometimes in ways that we need to rethink. And I think notions of the transversality of race, class, and gender in some ways can be it can be slightly misleading, because we're dealing with experiences of different types with many things in common, but working in quite different ways. You know, rather than trying to find some sort of core fundamental thing, I'd like to think about Venn diagrams and the way in which a whole variety of different expressions of oppression, of exploitation, of subalternization, of subjugation overlap on each other and things come together. But I think what's really crucial is not just, as it were, you know, structurally or statically to see that Venn diagram, but to see the way when people who have experienced all those myriad forms of injustice start to come together in talking actively in struggle and proactively seeking solutions to all those problems, and they start seeing all the common elements they have, they start to see the way there's a whole interlocking structure. That's the reason for all the different ways they've experienced those oppressions, and they start devising ways of acting against it. You get this moving Venn diagram, you get this sort of convergence going on, which doesn't smother or cancel out all the differences that are necessarily there, and you know, many of which just aren't going to go away even in a future socialist utopia, because human beings ultimately, you know, we've all got all sorts of issues going on, but they'll come to, and they'll provide the space where we can have the sorts of discussions, try and find resolutions, try and solve those almost intractable problems of human existence. So that for me, I think, represents a way for us to reflect also in a very Leninist fashion, because, you know, remember Lenin, he was constantly insistent, if you don't denounce injustices of all of its forms whenever it's seen, you're not yet a communist. And for me, if we really want a fundamental definition of what, you know, a Leninist is, you know, forget the historical baggage, but what's Lenin's politics? It's that fundamental denunciation of all forms of injustice wherever it is, and seeking to build the widest, largest possible mass movement of actively empowered popular actors against it. And that's definitely that's the path we can and should still be traveling along.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. I think that was a great way to end, and an excellent talk to end this series. I again wanted to thank all the comrades, particularly Rolando, but all the comrades from Viento Sur as well, and others who have been involved in this series of excellent talks. As I say, I hope they will all be online soon in their recorded form, and I'm sure you'll all join me in encouraging Peter to turn his paper into an article for historical materialism, so that we can read it in written form. Anyway, thanks very much to Peter. Thanks to all of you for attending. And yes, let's hope for a really fruitful way of continuing these discussions in print, in person, and online in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, all of you, for being here and contributing. We will be in touch.